Happening now. We want to welcome our viewers from across the United States and around the world. This is the EdTech Situation Room. Good morning, good day, good evening. This is EdTech Situation Room, episode number 142 on July 24th, 2019. I am Jason Neiffer. I am the Assistant Director and Curriculum Director of the Montana Digital Academy, the state virtual school located on the University of Montana campus in fabulous Missoula, Montana. But tonight, I'm joining you from a special location, special remote location. I am in Helena, Montana tonight, participating in the state of Montana State Social Studies Standards review process through our Office of Public Instruction. And joining me tonight, as always, Dr. Wes Fryer. Good evening, Dr. Fryer. How are you today?
Good evening. I am wonderful. I've been enjoying the week at home. My wife is up in Boston at Project Zero at Harvard with half of their first through fourth grade team and all of her third grade team, actually. And so I have been batching it and had the opportunity to call AAA with my daughter and get towed this evening. So glad to be here on time for the show. What is this show, Jason? What are we going to do here? We're going to talk about tow trucks and weather.
Well, I like tow trucks and weather, but our usual topics relate to headlines ripped from sources from around the world on technology news, and we tend to give them a little bit of an education spin. Both Wes and I work in educational technology in some way, shape, or form, and we like to talk a little bit about what do the tech headlines mean to you as educators, whether you are a classroom teacher, paraprofessional, IT professional, administrator. We like to kind of chat about what the future means for classrooms. And if you're interested in finding out more about the links we talk about any given week, you can go to our website at edtechsr.com. You can see show notes there of past episodes. You can listen to past episodes, and you can see the Google Doc that Wes and I share together where we talk about the things that are interesting in any particular week. So, Wes, where would you like for us to start this week?
Well, why don't we start on some privacy articles? I saw that you had put a couple in. I dropped one in, which, by the way, if people want to check this out, you can find these at edtechsr.com/links. This is an article from Mind Matters News and from Russ White, and this is from July the 1st. And the article is entitled, "Why You Can't Just Ask Social Media to Forget You." And we've been talking on the show for weeks and weeks about the perhaps inevitability of some regulation, the ways in which, the platforms right now, especially, talking primarily Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, are, not required to be moderating content and to, be protecting privacy of United States citizens. And so anyway, this is a very thought-provoking article saying, there's really not a silver bullet that we can just have, passed it. There's a author, Ned Ryan, who has, quote, proposed the individual's personal data is sovereign to the individual, and individuals have explicit right to control the data. And so he hopes that, we can have some kind of regulation. That way, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, that we've, talked about multiple times, is arguing for something called adversarial interoperability, which would mean that your data basically is stored in common formats, and then you're going to be able to take your information and access it. Basically, it's going to be a standards-based approach. But what it's saying is that social networks know things, number one, because of the hours and time and expertise that they've put into the algorithms they've written, to make inferences and put things together in terms of the profiles. But then also there are privacy implications because your information is tied to, I guess, the information of others. And so there's private property claims. That could, you could end up being exposed. And then there's really not an obvious way to just say, forget me, because the data is in so many different pieces and places and things like that. So basically, I think the article says it's really complicated, and there's not going to be, a single silver bullet solution to this issue of how do we assert some control over what is the new oil, the new gold of the 21st century, and that is personal data that is being, in most cases, voluntarily given up by people and then monetized by the platform. So, Jason, do you have words of wisdom relating to these topics, especially as they might apply to students, but teachers as well, in terms of data privacy and what we should advocate for. Because this article kind of leaves me like, oh man, I was hoping that EFF or somebody was going to solve it, and apparently they're not.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think part of this is that there's an ongoing conversation about regulation, and this would probably be an appropriate time to talk about that we didn't get to it last week, but Facebook has been fined $5 billion, which is the largest fine given by the I can't remember the FCC or FTC, but one of the two gave Facebook a $5 billion fine, and of course the coverage in the next 48 hours was twofold. First, the fact that $5 billion is like, couch change at Facebook headquarters, right? That it will not affect even the short-term bottom line all that much for Facebook. But secondarily, that the agreement that was announced doesn't really seem to imply that Facebook is going to change its practices. And, I think Wes and I have both been pretty strong advocates for net neutrality and keeping your hands off of the internet, because an unregulated internet was part of what created the massive .com expansion and a lot of really cool technologies. But we're going to have to figure out a way to regulate the internet in a way that does not hurt us, whether you're talking about our society from the standpoint of elections, our society from the standpoint of social cohesiveness, or the fact that our data seems so unbelievably vulnerable in all of these social tools. From a classroom standpoint, I'm still not really sure where this fits. It fits probably everywhere as part of the problem. And unfortunately, it's been a long time since I've been in a K-12 classroom. I have been in a number of higher education classrooms as a teacher in the last a decade. I'm a little jealous, Wes, of your new role where you will be back into a classroom again talking about these issues with kiddos. But, our students have evolved quite a bit since I've been last in a classroom. I would still argue that the whole digital natives thing is probably still a suspect construct. But what is happening, though, is that the kids that are coming into our classrooms, I'm not talking about our high school classrooms, I'm talking about really middle elementary up now, have cell phones or using cell phones, and oftentimes are in households where the family's not really doing the job of helping students understand what the inputs and outputs are in regards to data, personal data, and privacy. And I don't really blame parents for that. I think part of it is that there's so little good information, like easy to understand information for doing that. I'll give a shout out to you, Wes, the number of times you've brought parents into your school to talk about net-based issues, privacy. Parent education, I think, is a key part of this. But in absence of that, we also owe our students to be talking about these issues in a pretty nuanced way as well. But I guess really, short of band class, although you could talk about copyright band class, I'm not sure if the digital literacy or broader digital citizenship topics don't belong wherever you're at in the K-12 continuum.
Yeah, definitely. All right, where next, sir?
Well, there's a lot of interesting technical stories this week. Maybe I'll jump into the Google ones first, because they are of interest to me more directly. First, I want to mention something that's coming true to a Chromebook near you. By the way, I'm starting to work on a presentation I'll be doing, hopefully be doing. I'm proposing to the NCCE conference in March in Seattle, Washington, and I do feel obligated to let everyone know that if you're interested, NCCE's application to present at their conference, the deadline is August 1st. And so if you go to ncce.org, you too can apply to present at just a really great West Coast EdTech experience. But I'm working on a session right now that's called Advanced Chromebookology. Like, now that I have really, gone all in on Chromebooks, and it's really 95% of my computer time is on a Chromebook, I want to share some of the things that I do that are kind of advanced Chrome user pieces that help me be super productive on Chromebooks. But this is a big one for me. Chrome Unboxed, which is, I think, my favorite Chrome blog. It's between this and About Chromebooks, but Chrome Unboxed on July 21st announced two things. First, we know that virtual desktops was coming to Chrome. That's the notion that's available on Macs and Windows, where you can have different desktops, virtual desktops that you can flip back and forth from. I like to use it to create different workspaces for different projects, or perhaps communication on one, something productive on another, and another. We know that's been coming for several months now. now, but there's also going to be a keyboard command that will allow us to, or will allow you to switch back and forth between those, and then also a gesture. I believe it's going to be a four-finger gesture that will allow you to switch between the different virtual desktops. And I don't know a lot of people that pull off virtual desktops, not because they can't. It's because they oftentimes don't know about them. It was my favorite feature in Mac OS when I was predominantly a Mac guy, and eventually made it to Windows and now to Chromebooks. But in fact, at one point, when Wes, you and I first met face to face, you called them Jedi tricks with your Mac touchpad, and the same is now going to be available on Chrome. So I'm super interested in that notion coming to Chromebooks near you. And then one other quicker article here, and then I want to ask you a little more about Chromebooks in your school, Wes. Apparently, there is a lot of evidence, and this is from a number of sources, that more Chromebooks are going to be available with an LTE option. And the reason why that's interesting to me, the very first Chromebook, the CR48, actually had integrated LTE into it, or I'm sorry, integrated cell coverage into it. I don't know if it's LTE or not, but the idea was you could get free 200 megs a month of bandwidth, which is not a whole lot to work with, but still, nice in a pinch. And then the first Chromebook I had, which was an early Samsung Chromebook, also had 200 megabytes of free cell coverage. It's interesting to me because I feel like Google has been kind of going all in on instant tethering between Android phones and the Chromebook. But I have to say that when I'm using my Pixel 3a and my Pixel Book, so these are the flagship a phone and Chromebook experience, the tethering is not that solid, and it takes a while to get to it. And in fact, for me, it's a lot quicker just to turn on mobile hotspot on my phone and connect to it that way. So I know a lot of Macs on your campus, Wes, but any of the new Chromebook features tempting to you either as an end user or as someone that does advise on the purchasing of equipment?
I think we're still very much challenged and not at capacity in terms of utilizing features that we've had within Google Apps and on the Chromebooks. We purchased the Lenovo 300E, I think, Chromebooks a couple years ago. We got a couple carts of those. Those are the ones that actually you can use a number 2 pencil as a stylus on. But I did not have the opportunity this last year to experiment with those and really play with them. I don't know that our faculty did. So it's going to be an interesting year. I don't know for sure, but I really have a sense that we're going to talk a lot about one-to-one, especially at our middle school this next year. And one of the things that we finally bit the bullet on is we signed up for Adobe and the Creative Cloud and to do a site license. And so $2,500, that got us 500 licenses, and the expectation is that that's going to be primarily for our high school students as well as for faculty staff that want to have access to the Adobe products. I mention that because those are software client applications that don't currently run on a Chromebook. Now, some of the emulation and terminal stuff and things like that they're developing is going to be real interesting to see where that goes. But anyway, I am fully expecting, pretty soon, upon returning back to work in August, that we'll be underway with a lot of conversations about one-to-one. And the easy solution really is, let's just go with Chromebooks. But especially the conversations we've had, Jason, about 3 years and end of life and those kind of things. I mean, that really needs to inform the decision we make. We get such mileage, out of our Macs. And we have grades 5 through 8 in our middle school. So, if you're looking at getting a laptop at 5th grade, and it's only going to be a 3-year, Chrome device, I mean, that may not even get you to the end of middle school, much less into high school. So I think the return on investment and those kind of calculations, as well as, of course, what it is that you want to do with it. I am continued to be intrigued with your, I would say it could be your Google and Chrome Kool-Aid level. So like if we were rating it out of 100, I think
Right, right.
you're tapping out close to 99, and that's great. Because I do think that of the vast majority of things that we are probably doing in school, we can do really well within the Chrome browser. So I think security's got to weigh into that as well. And so obviously there's a bunch of different factors. I mean, you can end up getting another Chromebook in 3 years and, coming out ahead unless Apple does something really surprising and like comes out with, let's say, a MacBook that's, somewhere closer to the $500 range.
Right.
They're not doing that. So anyway, I'm not really being grabbed by any particular new features, but I think we may have mentioned last week the announcement at Google, or I mean at ISTE, about Google Classroom, I think, integrating better now into student information systems and
Right.
maybe really stepping into being a full-blown learning management system. That's probably the most exciting thing I've heard this summer with respect to, Chrome, but that's obviously Google Classroom is a cross-platform thing. It's not just a Chromebook deal.
Right. Well, and a couple of quick notes about this. So, one of the things, and we've mentioned this in context of consumer purchases, but this also applies to schools. I think one of the things that's happened, it's less so, but because I have vendors across my desk pretty regularly trying to sell me computers, even though we're not in the student computer business at the state virtual school in Montana. But one of the things that's true is that the older Chromebooks don't have a very long life to them. You can buy a Chromebook that is 2 or 3 years old, and it may be cheap, but it oftentimes comes with very modest hardware, much more modest hardware than I think an even average user might need. But also, Chromebooks released in 2019 have 6.5 years of guaranteed updates to them, right? Which is in my mind, is about as long as I'd want to keep a computer.
Is that for a top end, or is that?
No, that's all of them. Yeah, they're
Okay.
guaranteed now to have 6.5 years
Okay.
of
That's
life.
good
And then
news.
before it was 5, but the issue was that a lot of schools were purchasing dirt cheap Chromebooks because they heard about Chromebooks and they just didn't understand the architecture enough. And by the time they had purchased them, early days it was 5. Actually, the earliest days there was no deadline. Then they started announcing end of life because the earliest Chromebooks were just too slow to have a good user experience. Then they started with 5 and then eventually moved to 6.5.
Okay.
Is their current policy. But that assumes one purchased this year, right? So the problem, of course, with that is that if you are buying at a discount, or if you get the back of the truck offer, which sometimes comes schools' ways, especially if you know a company well and they may get a surplus of a large number. But I also question if you're buying a low-end Chromebook, even if it has 6.5 years of updates. My guess is that 4 or 5 years into that with the modest Chromebooks, I just think the experience would be terrible. I just think it'd be very slow and unpleasant and underwhelming. So for me, if you are buying a higher end Chromebook, that's one thing. And obviously I don't use a cheap Chromebook as my daily driver. I have some in the office that we utilize for testing purposes, and that we'll sometimes do in a pinch, or if I'm just typing without other tabs open is just fine. But I'm using, usually $400 to $800 Chromebooks as opposed to $100 to $300 Chromebooks, and that makes a pretty huge difference. But if you're talking about the $400 range, then and you're buying it at a couple years old and it only has 3 or 4 years of life, probably at $300, I think it's okay to turn those over in that particular way. But you definitely have to do your research and make sure that you're jumping in, because I think a 6-year-old MacBook, particularly a MacBook Pro, if that's what you're going with, is likely to be much more functional after 6 years than a low-end Chromebook, even if it is a more premium price product to start with. So one of the quick Google article, and then we can move on to other topics this week. We've mentioned in the past, I've turned into a Wear OS guy. That's Android's watch operating system. My current watch I'm wearing right now is this. I picked this up used for like $40. It's a Zen Watch 2. It's a 2-year-old watch that didn't really take off. And it's funny because when Android Wear started, they started with square watches. They were considered to be geeky, and so they moved towards round watches. Then, of course, the Apple Watch is square, and now this looks more like an Apple Watch. This gets mistaken for an Apple Watch more than anything else. And for what I use it for, which is mostly health purposes, I like the square screen over the round screen. But Google has just not done a very good job of keeping up with Wear OS. And although there are updates, and in fact the Wear OS experience is the best it's ever been, there's been two broad problems. Google's not putting enough investment in developing this, and they've not been able to nudge chipset makers into coming up with new versions of watch systems on chips or SoCs that allow for evolution in that space. And so I keep crossing my fingers. To be honest, the health features of the Apple Watch are so tempting to me, and I'm not just talking about the heart stuff, although that's part of it. I'm a diabetic. I'm insulin dependent. I take a variety of insulins all day long, and I have a constant glucose monitor that's attached to a part of my body 24/7. And the reason why I started wearing this over a Fitbit was because it would show me up to the minute data on my blood sugar, which allowed me to take more action without having to look at my phone screen to see what was going on. And that is an extraordinary thing to me. Like, I just can't begin to describe how that's been a real life changer for me, and really helped me in that somewhat difficult to navigate space of being an insulin dependent diabetic. And the bottom line is that if Android can't get their stuff together here, I think there's going to be a lot of people that just because the watch will move to Apple. And I gotta say, like, I don't know anyone who was an Android Wear wearer that's still wearing their Apple Watch. I'm sorry, their Android Watch. Oops. There's not a single person that's purchased an Apple Watch that has dropped the platform that I know. And that includes people who are not, like, my boss is not an Uber geek. He's tech savvy. He gets it, but he would have been the customer, I guess, that would be buying a wearable and sticking with it. And that Apple Watch hasn't left his arm since he purchased it. And he's given guys little mini Apple headbuds or earbuds, and it's extraordinary. And I just feel like Android is screwing up so badly here by not putting more thought or energy into this process. So just thought I'd mention that because it's a topic we've talked about before.
So on the Apple Watch topic, this is our last Google Hangout on air as a easy hangout for us to launch. We're going to be sad to see on August 1st the Google Hangout on air go away, and we're going to be testing a new feature. I've noticed tonight that it doesn't show us how many live viewers we have. I don't know if that's part of their changes to the platform. Shout out to Peggy George, who is in our chat room, and that is wonderful. I'm prefacing this by saying I really don't think my wife is watching the show because I'm about to disclose a birthday present. So we haven't had any, digital watches, as far as high tech smartwatches in our house. My sister and her family were here this past weekend, and I went ahead and bought my sister's second generation Apple Watch from her to give to my wife for her birthday, which I was actually out of town last week for her birthday. So anyway, it's going to be interesting to see that, just on a personal note. And I've certainly been, of course, eyeing that. And yes, for the health standpoint, the biometric feedback and being able to just have, I'm not really as interested in the messaging and that kind of thing as I am what seems to be the number one forte of the watch, and that is helping you become even more healthy and health conscious and attuned to different kinds of metrics and things like that relate to health. So related to that, we do have a couple other Apple articles, and one of them, and I don't know how this would impact the watch, but this is Ars Technica from yesterday, July 23rd. Apple asked Trump administration to exclude Mac parts from tariffs. And as you may know, the United States is poised to have like 25% tariffs slapped on all kinds of electronic products, to include, evidently, a number of parts that are used in the new Mac Pro Behemoth computer, which is not going to be one that probably we're ordering for school anytime soon. But anyway, that is pretty interesting. And we'll have to track that and see what happens. Is Apple, able to use its influence to get that through, or are they going to be subject, like the rest of the tech companies, to this basically trade war that's happening between the United States and China, and can definitely affect tech. You put the article in about the MacBook Pro and the $3,000 starting price. I'm sure the digital Montana Virtual Academy is going to be happy to spring for those for everybody, aren't they? I mean, just as like
Well,
end of year
yeah,
bonus, end of summer
new,
bonus.
new MacBooks for everyone, right? So yeah, the reason why I entered that one in there is because I know how much the super mobile graphic users love the 17-inch form factor. In fact, for a while, my wife, in a nonprofit she was working at, this is more than a decade ago now, was one of the first people I knew that owned one of the 17-inch MacBooks that in the early days, the pre-pro days. But it was such a great platform, like just a big, bold, beautiful screen, usually a full size keyboard that was a pleasure to type on. And although I have used we used a 15-inch before that had crossed my desk for a couple of months on its way to someone else in our office. It was a wonderful platform. I loved using it. Big, bold, beautiful screen, wonderful computer to use. The bottom line has always been that the 15 is great, but the 17 always seemed that much better. And 16 would be very close to that. It'd be basically what the form factor of the 17 used to be, smaller with the same size screen, because there would be smaller bezels on the platform. But it is interesting to see. It feels like Apple may be paying better attention to the needs of pro users again. And while I hope that that kind of moves into what some people refer to as the prosumer models. Those are models that have usually decent high-end hardware in them, but aren't intended for people that don't scoff at spending $10,000 on a desktop or $6,000 on a laptop. I do hope that leads to Apple going more in that space, because I think that is something that's still lacking in their catalog and model or models available. I'm probably unlikely to go all back in on Macs again anytime soon. I just am happy where I'm at on the Chrome platform, but it's nice to see them kind of innovating in that space, and so that's coming soon.
On the Apple note as well, I'll throw this one in. This is Ars Technica on July 12th. RPact returns to App Store, reviving debates about Apple's impartiality. I think we covered this some months ago, but when Apple released iOS 12, which was last fall, I think we did a parent university session about that in December of 2018. One of the best things, I think, and exciting things they released was their screen time functionality, and a lot of data that you could not only have about yourself, but you can also have about your kids if you're on the iCloud family, plan. Interestingly, as soon as our daughter turned 18, and this happened with our son earlier, boom, they're gone. They're not visible there anymore. But if they're under 18, you can see apps they're using, how many pickups they have during the day, and you too, which apps you're using the most, et cetera, et cetera. Well, at that time, Apple, basically coincident with that, had, I think, taken about 11 different apps offline. And part of what they had said was, hey, these apps are really enterprise function because they involve mobile device management and ways in which parents are exerting parental controls, but they are, doing things that are enterprise and basically have privacy implications. And some people felt like, well, they're also competing with screen time, and so Apple doesn't, want to have competition. They've taken over that function. They want you to use the built-in iOS 11, now iOS 12 function. So this article says that those apps have now returned to the store. They have successfully fought against Apple's decision. Apple had claimed this was due to privacy concerns. And there may be some validity to that, because of exploits and malicious attacks and things like that can happen via, these different ways of having some cloud-based software control over your device. But anyway, I think from a school standpoint, this is good to know, because RPact and some of these other apps are digital parenting apps that, are things that parents probably have used or have interest in. And so, probably on the competition is good for the consumer side of things, it's positive to, see those coming back into the App Store.
Great. So let's jump to, well, this is a little meta, but that meta is always fun. Talk about some news in podcasting. Obviously, Wes and I both obviously have a podcast. So that's that. I think we also both listen to a lot of podcasts. I will say that a lot of the articles in this week do apply to something that I've kind of been engaging in. I had to make a quick road trip last weekend and went into my podcast app and just got overwhelmed by the list. And I think I had over 400 podcasts that I was subscribed to in my podcast app. And so I went through
That's
and
crazy.
I did a massive cleaning, like just deleted. If I didn't recognize it, I deleted it. If it was ended, I deleted it. And luckily, Pocket Casts, which keeps getting better and better, has a really easy way to tell you if a podcast is likely either on hiatus or ending altogether. As an example, it's figured out that we generally release our podcast on Thursdays. So it will say the EdTech Situation Room next podcast likely Thursday is what it would say. So,
That's cool.
super cool AI behind that. But that cleansing came at a time that there've been a lot of articles in the last week. The easy one is that Apple is going to probably bankroll some original podcast in order to fend away from rivals that are moving into that space. We've talked about in past episodes, Spotify picked up Gimlet Media, so they have a growing library of podcasts. We've also talked about Luminary, which is a pay-for app that I'm currently purchasing because it has content that is there that's not available elsewhere, including the Note to Self podcast from WNYC with host.
And you have to buy their app or subscribe to get it?
You have to subscribe. It's $9.95.
This is called fracturing podcasting
behind
the paywall.
And that's part of my point, that I think that there's no word, and I don't think the Apple article talked about the notion of this would only be available on the Apple Podcast app, because that would be terrible in my humble opinion. But the industry is big enough now that and it's accessible to a lot of creators, which we've talked about in the past, has upsides and downsides, because it can introduce or give a megaphone to someone who perhaps is not spreading large amounts of joy as part of their regular process, while at the same time it gives an opportunity for smaller audience podcasts like the EdTech Situation Room to have an audience and be able to be on a consistent platform with the bigger pieces. But in a lot of ways, it seems like podcasting's at a crossroads, and there is more and more money going into it. And there's two articles this week that say basically the opposite thing. The Verge on July 19th gives some information about how now it's becoming a very lucrative industry, and I'm not talking about for the kind of self-made podcast hosts that are out there, of which there are many that end up doing a decent business as a podcast host, but also big players are in the podcast space. And then in the same 24 hours, the New York Times, and by the way, the Verge article talks about how there's a lot of international ground that's not being taken up yet, and a lot of people in the United States who would probably enjoy podcast content have not really discovered the space yet. It's still something that is a bit of a mystery to a lot of potential consumers. But the day before, the New York Times talked about how maybe we have hit peak podcast, and it did focus on kind of startup creators and the fact that anyone can have a podcast. And as I think both Wes and I have joked before, the proof of that is that Wes and I have a podcast, right? But the bottom line is that the industry is starting to come to ahead a little bit, and probably the next couple of years will be interesting in how podcasts exist, what the industry for podcasting looks like, and if it has a true future.
So on that note, talking about the purchase of Gimlet Media by Spotify, the other big purchase they did was Anchor. And so one of the reasons that I set up a new podcast back in, I want to say April, was I wanted my students, ideally, and who knows if anybody's going to actually do this, but if they have a smart speaker to be able to say, "Hey G," or lovely Madam A, play me the latest episode of blank. And so I'm excited to say that the Anchor app, which I firmly believe now, not only on iOS, I haven't used it on Android. You can, use it and see what you think, Jason. It is the fastest and easiest way, I think, to make a professional podcast, and you can directly publish, and it's all free. Hosting is free. Everything is free. You can, at least on Google Home, say, "Hey G, play me the latest episode of Class with Dr. Fryer," and you will listen to my latest podcast on Anchor. So I used it last week when I was up in Providence, Rhode Island for the Summer Institute on Digital Literacy. I actually ended up downloading the episode and putting it into my regular podcast that I've got like 1,700, at least according to FeedBurner, still subscribers that are coming to that podcast. But I agree that the crossroads is here. I certainly think that, it's a wonderful time for content creators and for just creatives in general in terms of the tools that we have access to. It's also very challenging with regard to disinformation and the ways in which bad actors and folks that are really fringe, folks that wouldn't have certainly gotten play in mainstream media today, can have a loud megaphone. So I'm going to be disappointed if we start to see the same thing in podcasting that we're seeing, between Netflix and HBO and Hulu and these other channels. And that is, hey, we've got our custom content. You gotta pay to come to our platform. And I totally get that in terms of video and that environment. But podcasting has historically been a very open format. There were people like Leo Laporte, who runs This Week in Tech and the Twit Network, so concerned about, Apple maybe trying to come after people using the podcasting name. They've used the term netcasts for years. And, I think those of us that have been involved in podcasting for a long time, maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but I'm definitely a huge advocate of openness and not saying, you can only subscribe using the Apple Podcast app or whatever. Sometimes people would only advertise that link, and then you really have to kind of do some work to say, like, what's the RSS link, the subscription link that I need to put this into my podcatcher or whatever. So I think I'm probably going to do an assignment that's podcasting based. That's an interview, with students. That's one of the things that I've got to, work out here in the next few weeks. Thankfully, teaching 5th and 6th grade, at least at our school, is not quite like teaching an undergraduate or graduate course where the whole syllabus has got to be essentially written in stone, signed in blood, and, done at the very first class period. I'll be able to have a little more agility and flexibility with what we do. But anyway, I've been thinking about that, and I think that helping people connect with podcasts and long form media content, which of course YouTube hosts as well, but it can really be transformative, right? In the same way that reading a book can be transformative because you have this long opportunity to have these ideas, enter into your brain and marinate. Podcasting does the same thing. So are you looking to launch a new podcast empire beyond the scope of the EdTech Situation Room in the next year, Jason?
Well, I feel like, Wes, that with the 20 hours we each put into the production of this podcast each week, right, that there's just no time for other voices. I do like that notion that of there are people that it literally is worth listening to them talk for 20 minutes while they're commuting to work, right? Like that's a real value that I think tools like that can be very valuable for. But I also like the notion that, as podcasts become more professional and more widely distributed and also I guess commercial in nature, that I'd like it that there's an app you can download that allows you to podcast with a click of a button, right? I think that's a great thing, and having that audience is a pretty wonderful thing. And in the same way that there's a broadcast YouTube button on my phone, and I think that's an enormously cool thing that really, I think provides a lot of opportunity for people to have agency about talking about the important things in their lives and important stuff that's going on in our world. So yeah, I think that's a pretty sweet thing.
And
So
I just say overall about that, I think we need to continue to remind um, everybody, fellow educators, but also, parents, students. There's so much value in social media, especially because it gives us this opportunity to kind of hang out with other brains, right? Like at a very basic level, all of us should aspire to try to hang out with people much smarter than we are. And Jason, that's why I'm here every week, right? To be able to just have some of that wisdom, through the ether, hopefully come over here. And to be challenged, right? The people that are doing the things we want to do, thinking about the things we want to think about, have skills that we want. And so I think that we are hearing, and we'll probably continue to hear, such amplification of how toxic social media is, how poisonous Twitter can be, how terrible the trolls are, and they can be, but you don't have to live in that world.
right,
I've thought about writing a blog post, and I might, where like the Twitter world I live in is different than yours or something, and I really, pardon me, I get this sometimes talking to different people. Like I realize, like, I literally live in a different headspace in some respects because of podcasts, the influence that I have, or the influence that other people have over me, because I'm listening to them. And anyway, I think that it's important that we continue to evangelize that, because the mainstream message, much as it is kind of with screen time, is it's all evil, it's all bad, just throw those things away. The message can be that social media is so toxic. Why don't we just ban it and do away with it?
right.
And I want to say, no way, Jose,
Yeah,
because my life has been enhanced and enriched in so many different ways. Hey, we wouldn't be having this conversation
yeah,
and
so true.
meeting with Peggy every week, right? If it wasn't this opportunity that social media presents us to have this niche and to connect in incredibly powerful ways, right? Like we could never have done this until I mean, we could have. The web heads were doing this in the mid 90s and late 90s and whatever, but like the bar was still pretty high for being able to do this. And arguably, right, we've got a geek quotient going here, but it just is it's phenomenal. And so I want to continue, of course, as we say at the end of the show, for people to reach out to us, right? It's definitely, you see statistics about downloads and whatnot. But hey, if there's an idea that you have, if there's something that you wonder about, or just when people are listening to the show, that's cool, right? It doesn't happen that often that people will actually, tweet that and share that. But that's something I try to do a lot in social media as I'm listening to people, as I hear ideas. I go ahead and share those. And I think it makes a difference, right? When people are hearing from the audience, knowing what resonates and being able to have that kind of a feedback. I mean, that's what makes the interactive web, the interactive internet, I think, still a magical place, even though it's filled with disinformation and poison and lots of negative stuff too. So.
Right, absolutely. And I would also note too that if you don't like your social media feed, start a new one, right? Like I one of the things that I've been very very careful about on Twitter is that my Twitter is full of education stuff, because I and Twitter talk about education, and I will once in a while tiptoe into politics, but I've actually created a separate handle that's not associated with me. That it's not about my identity as much as it's about just having a different feed for that purpose. But as it turns out, like if I really want to engage in politics, or I hear there was something important going on in DC today that seemed to dominate all of the headlines, right? And if I want to find out more about that, especially if I want to follow short span political theater, right? Like if you really want to hear what people have to say in 280 characters or less, I just log into that account, right? It's really easy on your smartphone to put multiple Twitter accounts on and then just turn off notifications, the ones you don't want to hear from. And then if you don't want to learn about politics, go on your education feed, where it's a lot of stuff that is related to my career and things that I am passionate about and things that I enjoy the debate about. and then just segregate it out. And that's also the reason why that I don't do a lot of work stuff on Facebook. Facebook is about pictures of people's kids and their dogs and cats and their vacations, in my humble opinion. I get to a little bit of work stuff there, but different channels for different means. And I think if we stopped trying to have one tool that does it all, I think it would help us segregate those parts of our lives a little better.
Yeah. And being able to filter in that way is just an essential skill of our
Yep.
current age as well as the future. So, hey, can you
There
do
you
the
go.
Apollo 11 article? And then I've got another moon landing related one to share as well.
Sure. Just a really great article from the Wall Street Journal on July 14th. Obviously, as I'm sure Wes has too, because I know he's a space geek as well, that I've been super into the Apollo 11 stuff in the last couple of weeks. And there was an extraordinary article from the Wall Street Journal that talked about that the real hidden hero of Apollo 11 wasn't the hardware, although the hardware was super cool. And obviously, miniaturization that NASA engaged in the 1960s really did lead to the personal computer of the 1980s and 90s. So make no mistake of the importance of hardware, but it was really the software that was really quite extraordinary. And it wasn't just creating code that did interesting things. In some cases, decades ahead of when we would have otherwise created a software to do similar things. But the extraordinary challenges that they had because of the environment and the space that they're talking about, it's an interesting history of how code played into that, and then of course how that inspired code to be something that then drove computer development for, well, frankly, the coming 5 decades that led to, the fact that Wes and I are in 2 different cities, in 2 different states, in 2 parts of the country. We are engaged in an almost high definition video conference where we are able to then broadcast to the world from a hotel room in Wes's home. So interesting if you are a history computer person, and also it's not hard to kind of draw back computer science as a broader industry, hobby, or even a field of study to the Apollo mission. So I encourage you to read that article if you are into the space history.
Absolutely. And I have a related video that I found. I've, yes, definitely tuned into some of the Apollo 11 coverage and some of the live, panel discussions involving both living astronauts and support personnel that were all over the place, around the globe, helping track, recover modules and all kinds of things. So in the midst of all that, either YouTube recommended this or somehow I stumbled upon it. It's not new. This is from January 29th, 2013, but it's a space.com video. Their channel is video from space, and it's called Moon Landings Faked. Filmmaker Says Not. And the description is writer-director S.G. Collins of Postwar Media debunks every theory that the Apollo moon landings could have been faked in a studio. And I'm going to say on a personal note, our daughter, our youngest daughter, who's going to be a sophomore, she's about to turn 16. She has had to confront more conspiracy theory content, more fringe content, to include, videos about the moon landings being faked, along with a bunch of other things than I ever had to. And I would argue that YouTube kids today, which is probably the majority of teens, and this may be unbeknownst to parents and educators, have faced, because of the algorithm, just a ton of fringe content. And so I think this is a really, really good question from a media literacy standpoint, as well as a historical standpoint with the, anniversary that we've had of Apollo 11, to talk to students about, do you think the moon landings were real? Why or why not? I'm not going to bet money on this, but if I wanted to gamble, I would bet that there's a large number of teenagers that'll be in classrooms, here in North America in just a few weeks as school kicks off, who have some serious doubts about this. And so this video is fantastic because it's from a technical standpoint, how there's absolutely no way that we had the storage, capacity on the cameras and the green screen, not green screen technologies, but just, he breaks it down through all the different things that you would have to do, and in order to make sure that it's perfect and there's not flaws and everything like that. I mean, the electronics weren't there. We are so inundated with high quality media today that I think, and this may be even more true for young people, I don't know, we just kind of take it for granted. Oh, that's can be tricked. We can fake that, we can trick that. Maybe today, I mean, of course today, the kind of quality that was coming back from the moon is something that's fakeable. But anyway, this is a great video. And so I actually shared that with Rachel. We haven't had a chance to discuss it yet, but I'm really looking forward to it because I think it just presents some very good factual information about the state of technology in 1969, through 73. And again, I think from a media literacy standpoint, we need to be awake to how YouTube, there's a fear and concern over radicalization. And there is that, I mean, in terms of like Islamic radicalization or other kinds of, really fringe groups, but just, content that's on the fringe, that's not mainstream, our kids have probably seen a lot of it. And then it involves the moon landing. So it's a great time to be working on media literacy and also talking about an incredible achievement. And of course, there's other good connections to make to that. I listened to the Annie Jacobson interview with Joe Rogan this last week, and she's the author of Operation Paperclip, which is a phenomenal book. I listened to that on Audible, and that's the story of how the United States following World War II, brought lots of Nazi scientists over to the United States so that we could beat the Russians to the moon and also develop ICBM's nuclear program, lots of stuff like that. So good connections and good conversations to have with kids. And if you want more backstory that's very intriguing to the space race, I would recommend Operation Paperclip by Annie Jacobson.
Awesome. Well, I want to do one more quick one just because it's interesting and funny to me. So earlier this year, I attended the inaugural DLAC conference, Digital Learning. Forgot what the A stand for conference in Austin, Texas. It's a K-12 distance learning focused conference it's already announced for next year, so it will be an ongoing conference. But it's my first time in Austin and my first time in a city that has the scooters.
You've never been to Austin, Texas before?
No, I had been, but not since the scooters were.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Yeah,
so
right.
I'd been there, I had barbecue. Actually, I've been to South by Southwest. I presented there before. So it's the first time I got to see scooters, right? And frankly, I think they're death traps, and I'm not coordinated enough to ride one consistently. And I'm a little more paranoid post kidney transplant about doing things that could hurl my body into something like a curb. So, but ignoring that, there's a video of me somewhere on the internet, and I did scoot one around one evening going out with the Virtual Learning Leadership Alliance tech directors, which is a pretty wild crowd. So we were enjoying that in Austin, but it was always kind of wild to me because like literally they are pick up and drop wherever you want, right? And they're app based, and so once you jump off of it, it just charges you for what you use. But apparently there is a thriving business, according to The Verge, today's Verge, where there are this thriving businesses, and I believe this one is in San Diego, where these scooters are being dropped in places that are private property, right? You can't go drop random stuff on private property because it's trespassing in essence. And there is a business that is basically scooter collections. I think they're calling themselves Scooter Scoops, where they show up, and if there are scooters on your property, they're unwanted property, you can just pick them up and they repo them. And they have yards now full of these various company scooters. And I think it's just super hilarious because obviously, it's another tale of the new economy, right? Is we're fumbling ways to maybe try to create less resource intensive, short-term transportation alternatives, yada yada yada. That now there is a business based on the new business, which is how to get rid of these annoyances for people. And I did talk to I think it was an Uber driver in Austin who said that there have been quite a few close calls where idiot scooters that are people that just don't understand that they're a vehicle, and you need to be cognizant of the laws of streets, etc. Are zooming past and in front of buses, and by the way, you versus bus and you're in a scooter, you will lose that battle, right? There's no scenario where you win being on the scooter. So I just thought that was an interesting article, that there's a new business picking up after a new business.
Wow. I'll do two quick ones then. We can do some Geeks of the Week. This is under the security tab. So Ars Technica from July 23rd reports judge allows suit against AT&T after $24 million cryptocurrency theft. Now, several things about this. So there's a guy who is a big cryptocurrency owner, and he was using his phone for two-step verification. And so he got hacked, and the first time contacted AT&T. They said they were going to implement this program where he was going to have to use this special like 6-digit code or whatever for somebody to grab their SIM. Because to kind of back up, like we've talked a lot about how using two-step verification and password managers, we all need to be doing that everywhere we can. Use different complicated passwords that are long on every single website. Do not repeat the password anywhere. The only way to do that and maintain your sanity is with a password manager like LastPass or 1Password, something like that. But then also turn on two-step. Well, your cell phone is actually not great, especially if people want to target you, like if you own millions of dollars of cryptocurrency, which by the way, I don't. Because they can call your carrier like AT&T and say, hey, I got this new phone or I lost my phone and I need you to swap my SIM card, and then they can take over your line. So that's what AT&T promised this guy to do. They failed to do it. Then he got hacked again, and like $24 million worth of cryptocurrency got stolen from him. And so he is going after AT&T, and it looks like the judge is going to allow for that. It's on appeal. But one of the biggest takeaways here is let's recognize that the cell phone text message is a very hackable technology. And so when it comes to two-step, your best bet is going to be like Google and have a physical key, a YubiKey or something else that you're actually either plugging in or it's using a wireless technology to authenticate to your device. Now, I still think using SMS two-step or multi-factor is better than no multi-factor. But I thought that was a pretty interesting article from a security standpoint. And then the last one is a Life Hacker article from July 19th that says these 8 browser extensions stole data from millions. And we'll talk a lot about Chrome and security and, how it's being wonderful. But there are malicious extensions that are out there. And we need to remember, and we need to remind students and teachers and parents and everybody else, when you click to install something on your computer, whether it's in your browser, on your phone, wherever it is, when you authorize something to access your data, like to access your Google account or to log in with Facebook or something like that, we need to be very, very careful. You need to make sure that whoever is the developer of that app or that extension or program, that's someone you trust. And how do you know that you trust them? Well, a lot of times that's because they are recommended to you by a reputable entity, by someone else who you trust, and you can also read reviews and things like that. It's challenging, but anyway, this was an eye-opening article talking again about how data, this is just another sort of eye roll, like, okay, another breach, right? Because we're so used to these happening. But it's a reminder that yes, even in the wonderful world of the Chromebook and the Chrome browser, there still are security threats and dangers, and we need to be savvy and careful. So those are my last two. Do you have some Geek of the Week goodness for us this week, Jason?
I do. I actually changed mine at the last minute because I remembered I listened to just part of my car trip this weekend. I started listening to a podcast that I queued up for a couple of months, but I hadn't listened to the episodes, and I'm so glad that I jumped in and did. The podcast is called Darknet Diaries, and it's wherever other great podcasts are available in various apps. But it is tales from white hat and not so white hat hackers, and we've talked a little bit in the past about a white hat hacker. It's the notion of someone who hacks for good or hacks to exploit holes so that people can patch them and figure out how to deal with X, Y, and Z. But just I listened to, I think it was 4 different episodes, and a lot about social engineering, the notion of hacking into something by encouraging someone to give you a piece of information or faking something or using some kind of theatrics tricks in order to get inside of a system. Probably the most famous example of social engineering is a couple of years ago. There was a security firm that did a test on a bank by sticking 25 thumb drives with malware and spreading them throughout the parking lot. And like 22 of the 25 of them ultimately were plugged into a work computer, which then distributed a payload of nastyware and called it good. But it's a little voyeuristic in that like you find yourself kind of cheering for the success of the of the characters that are trying to hack into systems. But if you really want to get to see how sneaky it is and how really human hacking is, right? The notion of you are taking advantage and finding exploits in human beings, it's an extraordinarily good listen, and it's especially great on long car rides. So that's Darknet Diaries, available where finer podcasts are aggregated.
That is great. I just shared a tweet to that, and then I'm doing a shout out to Brian Turnbaugh, who is WeGo Twits on Twitter, and he shared tons of great podcast recommendations with me at the Summer Institute for Digital Literacy. I'll include a Twitter moment that I put together last week that is filled with lots of the recommendations that he had. My geek of the week is from the Summer Institute on Digital Literacy, and it is phenomenal, and it's free. It's Timeline by the Night Lab. Have you used any of those tools that the Night Lab has put together, Jason? Timeline or oh my gosh, they've just got some fantastic projects. And so this is easy to make beautiful timelines that you simply use a Google sheet, a Google spreadsheet with. And so I'll include this link in the show notes as well. The Fryer Family Media Timeline. This has been my project today. I have cracked open the blue and white Macintosh G3 tower that we trucked up to Oklahoma in 2006 from Lubbock, Texas. And one of the reasons why I've continued to persuade my wife we don't want to get rid of it, we've got to keep it, is because on those hard drives, I had the original iMovies that I started creating in like 99 when iMovie came out. But at that time, when I exported them, I didn't have the web space, and we were like connecting with modems. Remember those, and then, dial-up internet, or slow direct connections. But we didn't have the speed to have high, bandwidth, because a 5-minute movie there was like almost a gig. So anyway, I have been exporting videos. You can link whatever you want, but I've been linking photo albums and then also videos that I've been using Handbrake, which is a great freeware program, which you can rip DVDs, but you can also use it, as I am, to convert DV video into streamable MP4 video. And I've been throwing that up on Amazon S3 because I don't want to deal with copyright strikes. And I used all kinds of course, copyrighted music in a fair use fashion, of course, for this non-commercial family production. But Timeline by the Knight Foundation, they've got other very powerful and cool tools, completely free, and integrates with Google Sheets. Love it. So Jason, where can we find you when you're not pontificating here on the EdTech Situation Room on Wednesdays?
Well, I'm on Twitter at TechSavvyTeach. I like to share articles throughout the week. I tend to have a bend towards kind of interesting blog at the Tech Savvy Teacher blog at the Northwest Council for Computer Education page, blog.ncc.org. And you, Dr. Fryer?
I am W. Fryer on Twitter. My blog, speedofcreativity.org. I actually published, this is sad, my third podcast of the year on my Speed of Creativity podcast channel, which I have been kind of a pod fader on, but had a real big reflection last week after this great Summer Institute on Digital Literacy. And I'm looking forward to being a lot more prolific in my blog posts as well as podcasts. You can also find me on Anchor. So if you can tell your smart device, Jason, you can test it and let me know if it works on the wonderful Madam A. Listen to the latest episode of Class with Dr. Fryer. So that's me.
Well, This action here, though, is the EdTech Situation Room podcast. We are a once a week podcast where Wes and I get together and talk tech. Sure, I think we do it because we like to talk to each other and get a lot off of each other's perspectives on the world. But we know from our listeners that there's usually some value for the listeners of our podcast as well. If you'd like to download EdTech Situation Room, we're available wherever finer podcasts are aggregated, including an app near you, or you can go and download teeny tiny versions on our website, edtechsr.com, where our show notes are also available. And at least for now, we are up on YouTube every week. We may have new ways of engaging with YouTube and broadcasting in the future, but I think we'll continue to put up episodes on our YouTube channel. Until then, we encourage you to stay safe, stay savvy, and we'll see you next time on the EdTech Situation Room.